As you know, the Congress of the United States passed a bill. The president's going to sign it that will get rail workers a new deal. They are, of course, still pushing for some time off, some lifestyle issues, work-life balance conditions there that they are working for. But the Congress and the president want to make sure we avert a rail strike ahead of the holidays. And to talk about it, I am joined by Herb Krohn. He is the Washington State Legislative Director for the Smart Transportation Division, United Transportation Union, and Attorney Jim Vucinovich, who is specializes in railroad issues. So, Herb, I want to jump in and start with you. Firstly, I want you to tell me, what the sense is from the workers and the union. What are they saying about this bill that's been passed?
Well, the workers are angry. The union is angry. Uh, we don't like the federal government stepping in and blocking our ability to utilize economic pressure to obtain our collective bargaining goals, because that's where we are. The Railway Labor Act is a very lengthy law that's designed to prevent strikes, and we've been through the entire every step in the law and have not been able to get a good collective bargaining agreement because the railroads have refused.
Oh, it looks like we've lost Herb again. But so, Jim, let me then ask you, from a legal perspective, this sort of takes the teeth away from a union, their ability to gain the ground and gain some of the working conditions that they're seeking. What kind of legal recourse do they have at this point?
Yeah, we wish that the options were greater than what they are in reality. But this has been something that's been a systemic problem, going back decades. When they passed an act in Congress, effectively taking away the ability of railroads to labor to strike, and that was removed in a particular act by Congress because railroads were deemed to be essential to the national security. With that in place, the most that the railroads can do can get to the very precipice of striking, but Congress can always step in and order a remedy, whether it's agreeable to the unions or not. This is a situation that's been building for years as the railroads have been making gobs of money, just gobs of money from Wall Street, and cutting their workforce by 30%, and then taking that remainder of the workforce and having these punitive attendance policies that don't allow them for time off. You would be amazed or shocked at what the quality of life or lack of quality of life that these railroaders must endure to meet the demands of their job.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've talked about that before, but I wanted to revisit it because it's not just that they are not really allowed time off, but they're punished when they do it. And we're talking about not just somebody who, wants to take a Saturday off because their child is having a birthday, but if they get injured or they're sick or they need to go to the doctor and they need to take time off, they're punished for that as well.
Yes. With the cutback in their workforce, then they also put in these draconian attendance policies that really eliminate the discretion a worker has to attend a child's birthday, go to a doctor's appointment, attend a basketball game or something like that. Everything that we work for and want to enjoy in our personal lives, these railroad workers have to sacrifice. They are constantly under the threat of being disciplined if they choose to try to take time off, which is unpaid, which is just remarkable, because they can then be subject to discipline. And indeed, there's a 3-strike rule. If they have 3 such violations on one of these policies, they can be terminated permanently. So it's an oppressive, punitive system. These workers are under incredible stress. It contributes to fatigue, and there's virtually no quality of life.
And Herb has rejoined us. Apologies, we're having some technical issues today. Poor Herb's in a hotel with no power right now, so he's doing his very best to be with us. And Herb, we appreciate that. We were just talking about the punitive nature of the attendance policies, but I'm hoping you'll talk a little bit about the difficulties that your colleagues have in terms of a work-life balance because of the attendance policies of the railroads.
Well, that's just it. We've got our power back now. The the railroads have cut staff dramatically to increase so that they can continue to increase profit. They're cutting the ability of shippers to ship goods. They're raising the freight rates for everybody. They've contributed significantly to America's supply chain crisis. In fact, there are articles that say they've caused it by researchers. But our members are in a situation where they cannot get adequate time off. You never know when you're going to work. You never know when you're going to sleep. People have worked their entire work lives with no regular sleep cycle, wake cycle, rest cycle, eating and sleeping cycle. And what we know about circadian rhythms and things like that today, it's a very unhealthy, hard life. And we always had the ability to take time off unpaid whenever we need it. We don't have paid sick leave. We never have. And so we were able to take time off whenever we needed to. And then in the late 90s, the railroad started imposing draconian attendance policies. They started out lightly and got worse and worse and worse. And it culminated just as COVID was occurring in February of 2020, when the Union Pacific issued the most regressive attendance policy in the country. If you are on a regular assigned job and you are absent for 4 days, not consecutive days, but just 4 individual days in a 91-day period, you were fired automatically. It was they have now changed it to 2 strikes and fire you on the second time. But if you miss 4 days, your child gets sick, your wife gets sick, you get sick in a 91-day period, and you miss any 4 days, you are subject to attendance discipline. And that's it mirrors the BN's policy, but the railroads never like to be outdone by each other. So in February of this year, the BN adopted even a more regressive policy than Union Pacific's, called high vis. And we have seen railroad workers leaving like never before. I mean, people walk with 5, 10, 20 years of railroad experience and railroad retirement credits, quitting and walking away from the industry because they can't get time off with their families. It's been horrible. I mean, and the way the railroad life works is that you go to work when you're called within a 2-hour call. It's one of the probably the only industry in America in transportation where you don't get a 10-hour notice or 12-hour notice to go to work, or 24-hour notice if you're a pilot. You get a 2-hour call, in some cases 90 minutes, and you have to be there and go to work regardless. So say you may spend all your time on the road and you get home long enough to sleep and eat and get called back, and you can spend months where you never see your family. So we rely on railroaders rely on their cell phones and looking up to see where how close they are to being called. It's called a train lineup, and they're notoriously inaccurate now. And for example, you could be in Portland waiting to come home. You think you're going out at noon, so you get up at 8 o'clock in the morning and wait for your call, get dressed and eat, and your call never comes. And finally, you get called at 9 p.m. to go to work. So now you've been up for 13 hours, and you go to work. You take a train back to Seattle, and say you arrive in Seattle at 8 a.m. on a Saturday morning, and you look at the train lineup as you're tying up at the computer to go home, and you say, "Oh my God, I'm 25 times out. I'm 25 people away from being called again." And the train lineup shows only 4 trains in the next 36 hours. I'm going to have a day and a half to stay at home. So I'm going to stay up today and spend time with my wife and kids, because I haven't been home and spent any time with them in 3 months. So I'm just not going to go to sleep. And tomorrow I'll get up and mow the lawn and take care of some other things, but I'm going to have 36 hours off. So you stay up all day with your family, and you go to bed at 10 o'clock that night. And 1 hour later, at 11, the railroad is calling you to go to work because everything went to hell. And this happens all the time. So you've been up for 39 hours consecutively, no sleep. If you tell them you're too tired to go to work, you will be disciplined.
Yeah.
And depending if you've done it before, you're likely to be fired. I mean, that's what railroad life is turned into now. You know you're not safe. You know that it's a danger to the public. What if you're hauling an oil train or hazardous materials and you haven't had sleep? You know, you're now going to, by the time you get to your destination, you're going to have been up for 52, 54 hours or longer. And that's just a very unsafe situation. I mean, when people see big trains moving through their communities, long haul freight trains, you can almost rest assured that the crew members on board that train are suffering from chronic fatigue. And how we managed it all these years was we were able to just take the time off when, if we were too tired, we'd call them and say, we need 24 hours off or 12 hours off. And you were given it because you're not paid, and you're only paid if you work. And then they discipline you for it. We have had a lot of members disciplined for COVID. The policies specifically state, you can get a doctor's note, but we don't have to honor it. It doesn't mean anything to us. So we end up in discipline hearings and cases on appeal, and it can take 2 or 3 years to get a railroad arbitration case to a neutral arbitrator, which means you'll be out of work for 2 or 3 years until your case is resolved. If you do get your job back. The bereavement policies were written in the 70s, and you get paid bereavement leave of up to 3 days for your parents, your siblings, your children, your spouse, your spouse's parents. No one else qualifies. So if your grandparents die, or your aunt or uncle dies, or someone who raised you dies, like a grandparent, aunt, uncle, whatever, and they die, you have to take unpaid time to go, and you will be subject to discipline for bereavement. It really, you live your life with no predictability. I mean, one of the things in the new agreement will give you 3 planned medical visits a year, but you have to give the railroad 30 days advance notice or more. It has to be on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday in a week with no holidays. And that's, for a planned medical appointment. And I sort of joke, well, it can only be in a leap year, and you have to provide a note from the Wicked Witch of the West in order to get that day off. They make it as hard as possible, and our members are tired of being punished. We have had a lot of members who have been punished or terminated for illnesses and injuries of themselves or family members, and for COVID. I got a call just last week from a local chairman who has a member who needed 2 days off to get a COVID shot and wait for the side effects to get over them. And they disciplined him for it on BNSF. I mean, this is a common thing, and it's happening all the time. It's outrageous. Everyone else in Washington has paid sick leave, and we can't even get protection from unpaid time off for legitimate reasons. Instead, we're subject to discipline. And I mean, that's why railroaders are so angry. They're furious about it. We are working in a situation in the American railroad today that is like the 1890s. Our break policies to get meals when you're working were written by the federal government and imposed in agreements in 1919. During World War I, when the government controlled the railroad. And our meal agreement rule on Union Pacific is almost identical to what the General Director of the U.S. Railroad Administration issued in 1919. Well, World War I's been over for 103 years. We ought to be able to get a 30-minute meal period instead of a 20-minute meal period. We don't get breaks. And they push people to not take their meals. They harass them for taking a meal break. It really is a horrible situation. I mean, railroad workers have gone way backwards in time in terms of how the railroads are treating their employees in comparison to every other industry. They have made things miserable, and people don't want to work for the railroad. They hire out now. They fight to hire people who can pass drug tests and be able to read and write and understand rules. And they get into these classes, and when they realize what the railroads are going to expect of them, they quit. Or if they do make it through the class, a lot of them will quit when they start going out and working with railroaders and finding out what the expectations are on their lives, that they are not going to be able to be there when their child is in a school play, or when there's a family emergency, or when there's a graduation or a birthday. I mean, railroaders give up a lot to keep freight moving in America. And we kept freight moving through the pandemic, even though the railroads did almost nothing to protect us. We weren't screened when we went to work. We weren't required to wear masks. They didn't clean locomotives. You're working with crew members in tight conditions in vehicles and locomotive cabs, sharing the same air for 12 plus hours. And yet a lot of people caught COVID. And the railroads didn't even notify coworkers in many cases that they had been exposed. We have members dying from it, and we kept the freight system in America rolling. We deserve better than this. And that's why railroaders are angry. And unfortunately, we would have been better. I think the way it's going to turn out is we would have been better. The government and America would have been better off to let us strike for a few days to get the railroads to finally come to the table and seriously negotiate the things to make our lives better. Because what's going to happen now is people who have been there for the last few years are going to get these checks in 60 to 90 days, and they're going to quit. They're leaving. They're going to go somewhere else. I would venture to say that 10 to 15% of the people who did vote for the collective bargaining agreements did so they could get the money and leave. And if you have a strike, you're going to be back to work when the strike is over, 10, 14 days or 5 days or 3 or whatever it would be, and freight will move again. But when you lose 20 to 40% of the workforce, it's going to take years to recover from this, because you can't just put people out there and expect freight to move. It's not going to happen. And you're going to have inexperienced people training inexperienced people, and you're going to have wrecks and, hope God forbid, hazardous material leaks and things like that, because you're going to have inexperienced people who are going to be having to learn what really takes 5 to 10 years to understand fully. It's a real sad and dangerous situation for America, and it's just unfortunate. Our members are very angry, and all we're asking, the paid sick leave is fine, but just give us back our agreements that we collectively bargained that allowed us to take the time off unpaid. I mean, that's better than what we're living with right now.
And without punishment too. I know a lot of us couldn't even imagine working under those situations. And I want to back you up just a little bit, Herb, quickly here, because you touched on it a little bit in terms of a lot of these workers have quit, whether it's because of the working conditions or for whatever reason. Others, of course, as you said, have been punished and fired. And, I was sort of under the impression that part of the reason that the rails are so short-staffed is because so many people were leaving. But you also mentioned that the railroads themselves have cut back on staff. So it sounds like it's a combination of both.
Oh, yes. I mean, but, before these worse and worse, before the more regressive attendance policies, the railroads were cutting back staff dramatically. They have adopted a operational philosophy called precision scheduled railroading. There's nothing precise about it, and there's nothing scheduled about it, but it is a philosophy to cut costs, just throw trains together and move things and that's also why people are seeing trains that are 10,000 or feet in length, 2 miles long or longer. I was in the desert Southwest. I've seen trains that are 20, 25,000 feet in length, because they're trying to cut costs, cut staff, and operate as, they've cut maintenance. They're not maintaining equipment. They're not maintaining the rails. There are a lot more breakdowns. They're not maintaining anything because they've cut the staffs that do that. I mean, for example, the Mosier oil train fire on the other side of the Columbia River a couple of years ago. That was caused because the railroads stopped doing walking inspections. They didn't want the fewer maintenance away people to do walking inspections of the tracks. And they're relying on technology. Well, technology can't dig down and look like sonar, into the ground, and the tie bolts were rusting out. And how they would be discovered is once or twice a year, a maintenance away crew would go through that area and they would tap the heads of these screws with a piece of rebar, and they could tell whether they were rusted. Well, oil trains put a lot of tension on tracks. They're very heavy. And what happened is finally all these tie bolts that were rusted broke free. And if they had walking inspections, it wouldn't have happened. But the railroads don't want to invest in that. They're squeezing everything they can, selling things off, shutting operations down, and getting rid of people as much as they can. Even with the Surface Transportation Board hearings that happened in April, where virtually every industry in America has testified that they're not getting the service they used to get a year and a half, 2 years ago from the railroads. They can't move their freight. They're being told, they're only going to get service. The railroads have continued to cut. In Union Pacific, they've cut industries that have been serviced once a day, like the glass plant on Marginal Way in Seattle. It was serviced every day for years, 3 days a week now. They're impacting other industries and other jobs because they're squeezing for greater and greater profits. And they did this in August. And it wasn't because we didn't have the staff to do the job. In fact, they hired a few people here recently in Seattle, and they don't want to create jobs for them or restore positions. So they make them go to Portland, even though they live here. They make them go work in Portland. Eventually they'll come back, but when other people quit. But they'll come back unfamiliarized. And it really, this austerity program railroad profits are among the most profitable industry in America. Union Pacific, a couple of years ago, it's been reported, was more profitable than Google. And they're hurting our country. They're hurting our economic security. They're hurting workers. And they're hurting the entire economy. The entire economy is suffering because they're raising their freight rates, because they say, oh, well, we can't move your cars. We can't move as many cars now. And they created it. They're the ones who got rid of people, all over the country. People get hired with the railroad. This is what happens here all the time. They hire them, they train them. By the time they're ready to go to work, it's November. And then they want to furlough them. And in this case, they sent a couple of new hires in Seattle to Portland to keep them working, but they don't even have to give them lodging. It was the first time ever where I've got them to provide them lodging for the first 30 days. We have people when they're forced down there, they won't even give them a hotel room. They have to sleep in their car in the yard parking lot. And it's really no other industry operates like this, and it's all greed and profit driven, and nothing about railroads are monopolies, and they're supposed to be well regulated, and they're supposed to operate for the benefit of this country. And the government gave them the land to build the railroads, and they have an obligation, a legal obligation, where they're supposed to be providing service, and they're not. They're doing everything they can to squeeze everything they can out of everyone and everybody, including their workers, including their shippers. And Americans are paying the higher costs in the grocery store shelves and shopping because of the railroad industry's gouging of America's industries for greater profit. And we're caught in the middle. That's part of the problem, is that there have been board awards and things that have, under the Railway Labor Act, if a neutral makes a decision, the only way you can appeal it is if you can prove that there was collusion or corruption or bribery. There has to be you can't appeal a decision because it's wrong. And a railroad arbitrator is not supposed to override a collective bargaining agreement. They're supposed to interpret them. The attendance policies, when they came about, the arbitrators ruled that railroads could have reasonable attendance policies. Well, they're no longer reasonable at all. But nonetheless, these policies voided collective bargaining agreements that did allow us to have that unpaid time off, that allowed it, like in this area, for the most part, railroaders could take up to 15 days off. You could work like a pig every day for months, put some money in the bank, and then say, I'm tired, let's go to Hawaii, honey. Buy your ticket and call the railroad, say, I need 15 days off. I'll report. And now you can't do that. And when you hire out with the railroad, it might take you 2 years before you even get 1 week of vacation. But they hire people, they furlough them so often right after they're finished with training. because November, December is a slow time. Christmas orders have been delivered. And sometimes it's been months before they call them back to work. Well, if you got through training and then they furlough you, is this a place you really want to work for? So they quit. A lot of people don't come back, and you can spend your first 5 years with the railroad being furloughed for 2 to 4, 6 months of the year, not being able to work and having to go find another job to support your family. And then they call you back again when they need you. It's been, penny wise and pound foolish, but, the hedge funds like that. They like the money, and that's what we're fighting.
Okay, so I want to ask both of you, and I'll start with you, Herb. Now that this bill has been passed to avert the strike, what can you do? Do you have any kind of teeth? Is there anything that you can do, any kind of legal recourse to try to get, some of these days off, whether they're paid or unpaid?
Well, here's what we've been working on. We've been actually working on this before this all came to a head. We're working on a bill here in Washington that's called the Safe Leave Act for Washington railroad workers. And it would prohibit the railroads from disciplining rail workers for taking unpaid time off for illnesses or injuries of themselves or family members, or for medical appointments. It would provide them with 7 unpaid days of bereavement leave for any of the same relatives that are recognized by the state under the state's paid sick leave laws. It mirrors the paid sick leave laws, but there's no pay involved. But it would protect us if you lay off or absent yourself for after 4 days. The railroad could require you to provide a doctor's note. If you don't provide the doctor's note, then they could discipline you. It also provides some modifications to the FMLA law, because that's what the railroads do. If you've got an issue, they tell you to apply for FMLA. But then they also they engage in a practice that I call excessive depletion. So if say you have FMLA because you have a sick child, and you take the child, you lay off today to take your child to the doctor tomorrow morning, and then you mark up tomorrow at noon. You lay off for 24 hours, and you missed a call to go on a train that would have taken you to Pasco and then Vancouver, so you would be gone for 4 days. They track the time that the person who substituted for you is gone, and they deduct all of that time from your FMLA bank of annual time. So you only took 24 hours off one day, but they're going to deduct perhaps 4 or 5 days of time, 96 hours or more, from your FMLA time bank to deplete it quickly so you can't use it. And that's an obscene practice. But airline employees received some relief from a federal bill that Patty Murray ran in 2009 that the railroads blocked us from getting. And it provides them with easier access to get FMLA. It lowers the threshold, because if you are traveling on a train and you get to your destination and you're staying in a hotel, after a certain amount of hours, I think it's 12 hours, they have to start paying you what's called held away pay until they start moving you onto your next destination. But that pay does not credit for FMLA time for earnings. So airline employees, because of the deadheading and the same things railroad workers do, they received a lower threshold to qualify for FMLA. And we're trying to, the state law would do the same.
Herb, you might want to mention what's happening on a national scale too.
Yeah. Well, on a national scale, there's not much happening, I don't think. Do you know something I'm unaware of, Jim?
Well, I think, I mean, ironically, the contract negotiations are up for renewal starting next July, and I know that attendance will be part of that. But I mean, here on the heels of working without a contract for 2 years, they're having to restart the process in as little as 7 or 8 months. So there aren't effective tools right now for labor to address these quality of life issues. And what Herb has described, over the years and decades of tightening these policies without sufficient oversight or regulation, reducing the workforce, and then adding a punitive layer of attendance policies on top of it, have really it's unsustainable, and it's brought really the industry to a breaking point, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Too, I'm sorry, Herb, I didn't mean to cut you off there, but Jim, I want to ask you too, since we're running out of time here, from a legal standpoint, if Washington State were to pass this law, considering that the railroads are regulated by the feds, would that create a jurisdictional issue that we might see the courts toss that law out?
Yeah, you will no doubt see some challenge. I mean, and I think the difficulty that rail labor has is that you can have success at the state level, but that will be challenged in terms of these national agreements. The so-called word preemption would be brought against any such state law. I mean, I think Herb can probably speak to that. There have been some successes, concerning some issues regarding rail safety, but on the broader issues that can be brought under the jurisdiction of these collective bargaining agreements, you're going to have that challenge, undoubtedly.
Yeah, the railroads fight everything, but the Attorney General of Washington's looked at this law. The state cannot require the railroads to provide benefits without compensation. That's why we're not covered under the state's paid sick leave law. But the state can protect rail workers' health and safety. And that's what this bill would do. It is a health and safety bill for the well-being of rail workers. We call it the Safe Unpaid Leave Act for Washington Rail Workers. The prime sponsor in the Senate is Senator Patty Cooter. We're looking for a new prime sponsor in the House because of House turnover. But we have been fighting for this bill for about 6 years. And we think with everything, with all the attention that's happened, we may get this bill to finally pass this year and provide Washington rail workers with additional protections. And if it passes here, other states are likely to do it as well. So yes, we believe that it is not preempted by federal law. The railroads will always challenge everything, but the states do have a legal right to protect the safety and health of the public and employees, and we believe that they can do that with a bill to protect us from unpaid time off for these reasons.
Okay, so Herb, again, with very limited time, what can we expect as consumers if we see this mass walkout after the back pay kicks in from this new deal passed by Congress?
We can expect a meltdown of the American railway operational system, meaning dead trains everywhere, no crews to be able to move them, and rail freight coming to a halt to a great degree. We can expect very slow movement of freight in America, and we can expect higher prices and empty store shelves. That's what would happen if we lose 20 to 30% of the workforce. I mean, ultimately, we'll see. But we know a lot of our members are telling us when they get that money, they're leaving.
Yeah, and correspondingly, I think you're going to see a rise in safety issues. I mean, you'll have even less workers out there, under more unsustainable conditions, working with fatigue, working with inadequately inspected trains and equipment that could give rise to, more injuries, more accidents, more delays, in the communities where these trains are stalled out.
All right. Herb Crone with the Smart TD Railroad Workers Union, attorney Jim Vucinovich. Gentlemen, thank you both. Really appreciate you taking so much time.
And anytime you have questions or want to talk about rail issues, always happy to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Very good.